I still remember the way his laughter would cut through a room. Sharp and sudden, like the crack of a judge's gavel. Only there was never any justice in it. Just the familiar sting of humiliation that would follow, as predictable as my silence. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. My Uncle Robert had a special talent for turning me into the punchline of every family gathering. Thanksgiving, Christmas, 4th of July barbecues. It didn't matter. If there was an audience, I was his favorite target. "Hey everyone, here comes the mouse," he'd announce whenever I walked into a room, his voice booming over conversations. Careful not to speak too loud, you might startle her. And everyone would laugh, every single time, as if it were the most original observation they'd ever heard. The chuckles would ripple through our family gatherings like a wave, washing over me, drowning whatever small fragment of confidence I'd managed to build since the last time. I learned to enter rooms differently after a while. Shoulders hunched, eyes down, slipping in through side doors when possible, making myself smaller, quieter, proving his point with every cautious step. My parents never intervened. Mom would sometimes offer a weak, "Oh, Robert," with a smile that looked more like an apology to him than support for me. Dad would clap him on the shoulder as if to say, "Brothers, right?" Their silence was another kind of verdict. "This one couldn't argue her way out of a parking ticket," became his favorite line about me. He'd toss it into conversations casually, usually after I'd shared some small achievement or opinion. The comment would hang in the air, and whatever I'd said before would dissolve into insignificance. I was 22 when I told my family I wanted to study law. We were at my cousin's graduation party, the backyard filled with folding tables, and relatives I saw only at celebrations or funerals. "I got accepted to Harrison Law," I said quietly, when Aunt Patty asked what I was doing after finishing my bachelor's degree. The conversation around us paused just long enough for Uncle Robert to hear. He almost choked on his beer, making a dramatic show of coughing and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Law? You?" He looked around, making sure he had an audience. "You can't even stand up for yourself at the dinner table. What are you going to do in a courtroom? Whisper at the judge?" The laughter that followed was like an echo I'd heard all my life. I smiled, tight-lipped, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Heat crawled up my neck and settled in my cheeks, painting them the color of humiliation. "She's serious," my mom said. But she was smiling too, like my ambition was a child's cute misunderstanding of the world. "Good for you, sweetie," Aunt Patty said, patting my hand with the gentle condescension reserved for unrealistic dreams. Uncle Robert was still chuckling, shaking his head. "Harrison, huh? Well, I guess they need students who'll make the others look good." He worked at Branford & White, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. Every family gathering included at least 3 stories about his important cases, his corner office, his golf games with judges. He wore his success like a tailored suit, impeccable and meant to be admired. I excused myself soon after, retreating to the quiet of my cousin's childhood bedroom. I sat on the edge of the twin bed, surrounded by soccer trophies and band posters, and wondered if they were right. If I was deluding myself. If I was just a mouse pretending she could roar. But beneath the doubt, there was something else. Something that had been growing quietly for years, like a seed planted in rocky soil. Not anger exactly, something cooler, more patient, determination. I started law school that fall. I didn't tell anyone when I made law review. Didn't mention the moot court competitions I won. Kept quiet about the internship at the district court that turned into a clerkship. Family gatherings continued their predictable rhythm. Uncle Robert would find new ways to remind everyone of my inadequacy. I'd smile and retreat. The family would watch the familiar play unfold, comfortable in their assigned roles. "How's school?" he'd ask at Thanksgiving, as if genuinely interested. "It's good," I'd answer, knowing what was coming. Must be nice, hiding in libraries all day. The real world's a bit different, though. He'd wink at my cousins. No judges to hold your hand when you're facing a real shark in the courtroom. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that behind closed doors, I was different. I studied relentlessly. My apartment transformed into a fortress of case files and legal texts. Constitutional law became my bedtime story. Civil procedure, my lullaby. I learned the language of justice not to fight back against my uncle, but to find peace within myself. I didn't need applause or recognition. I needed clarity, purpose. Every exam passed, every argument crafted, added a brick to a tower no one in my family could see rising. During my second year, I started clerking for Judge Harriet Winters in county court, a jurisdiction far enough away that no family member would ever stumble into my world. There I wasn't Robert's timid niece. I was a mind to be heard, a presence to be counted. Judge Winters was everything I hoped to become, brilliant, measured, and uncompromising in her pursuit of justice. She spoke in a voice that never rose, above conversational tone, yet commanded complete attention. Power, I realized, didn't have to announce itself with volume. "You have good instincts," she told me after I helped draft an opinion on a complex contract dispute. "And you notice details others miss." I tucked her words away like treasures, small counterweights to the years of my uncle's mockery. My name started appearing on things that mattered: dockets, memos, opinions. Not prominently. I was still just a clerk. But there, in black and white. Proof that I existed in this world of words and reason, where volume didn't equate to authority. When I graduated, Judge Winters recommended me for a position with the district attorney's office. 3 years later, when she was appointed to the federal bench, she brought me with her as her clerk. "You should consider the judiciary," she told me one evening, as we worked late preparing for a complex securities fraud case. "You have the temperament for it." I almost laughed. The idea seemed as foreign as suggesting I fly to the moon. Judges were confident, authoritative, everything I still couldn't see in myself despite my accomplishments. "I'm not sure I'm assertive enough," I said, thinking of all the family dinners where I'd swallowed my words along with my pride. Judge Winters looked at me over her reading glasses. "Assertiveness isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about having the clearest vision of what's right." I carried those words with me through the years that followed. Through my time as an assistant district attorney. Through my appointment to fill a vacancy on the municipal court. Through the election where I retained that seat, my name on ballots and lawn signs throughout the county. Through it all, I maintained my distance from family gatherings, attending only when absolutely necessary. When I did go, Uncle Robert's comments continued, though with slightly less frequency. I'd accomplished enough that even he had to acknowledge some success, though he attributed it to connections and being in the right place. "Little Alice must have finally found her voice," he'd say, raising his glass in mock toast. "Though I bet she still squeaks when the pressure's on." I'd smile and say nothing, knowing that my silence was no longer born of fear, but of choice. Some people weren't worth the breath it took to correct them. And then, 5 years into my judicial career, those two worlds, the one where I was perpetually inadequate and the one where I was respected, collided in a way I never could have anticipated. It was at the Riverside Foundation Charity Gala, an annual event that brought together the city's legal and business communities to raise money for children's education programs. As a sitting judge, I was invited to represent the court. I accepted. As I always did for causes I believed in, I was speaking with the district attorney about a community outreach program when I saw him across the room, Uncle Robert, in a tuxedo that seemed slightly too tight around the collar, moving through the crowd with that familiar strut. He was with a group of men I recognized as partners from his firm, Branford and White. My first instinct was to retreat, to find another corner of the ballroom where our paths wouldn't cross. Old habits surfaced like muscle memory. But before I could excuse myself, the district attorney touched my elbow. "Lawrence Branford is heading this way," she whispered. "He's been trying to get on the Judicial Appointments Committee for months." I turned to see an elegant man in his 60s approaching us, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to influence. Behind him trailed several associates, including my uncle. "Your Honor," Lawrence Branford said, extending his hand to me with a respectful nod. "I'm delighted you could attend tonight. Your support means a great deal to the Foundation." I shook his hand, acutely aware that my uncle had frozen mid-step, his mouth slightly open in confusion as he registered who Branford was addressing with such deference. "The pleasure is mine," I replied, my voice steady and measured, the same voice I used in my courtroom. The Foundation's work in expanding legal education to underserved communities is vital. Uncle Robert blinked rapidly, his eyes darting between me and his boss. I could see the pieces clicking into place behind his expression, disbelief wrestling with dawning recognition. "Your Honor," Branford continued, placing a respectful hand on my shoulder, "I don't believe you've met everyone from our firm. This is James Weston, our head of litigation, Patricia Chen from corporate law, and—" He turned slightly, gesturing to my uncle. "Robert Keller, one of our senior associates." The silence that followed felt like the waited pause before a verdict is read. My uncle's face had drained of color, his usual confident smile replaced by something stiff and uncertain. "Actually," I said quietly, "Robert and I know each other." Lawrence Branford raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "Alice is my niece," Uncle Robert managed, his voice lacking its usual robust timbre. Branford's eyes widened with delight. "Your niece? You never mentioned your niece is Judge Alice Keller, one of our most promising judicial appointments in years." Uncle Robert's laugh came out strangled. "Well, We're very proud of her," Branford continued, either oblivious to or ignoring my uncle's discomfort. "The firm has been following your rulings on the Wexler antitrust case with great interest, Your Honor. Brilliant analysis of the market consolidation issues." "Thank you," I said, maintaining my composure even as I felt a strange lightness spreading through my chest. Not triumph, something quieter. The simple, profound relief of being seen. "I had no idea Robert was related." "To you," Branford was saying, looking between us as if trying to find the family resemblance. "Though now that I think about it, he's mentioned a niece who went into law. That must be you." My uncle cleared his throat. "Yes, Alice has always been interested in the legal profession." The hesitation in his voice, the careful rewording of history, it was almost imperceptible. But I noticed, and from the slight narrowing of Branford's eyes, so did he. "More than interested, I'd say," Branford replied pointedly. "She's distinguished herself remarkably." He turned back to me. "The firm is hosting a panel next month on judicial independence in the modern media landscape. We would be honored if you'd consider participating, Your Honor." Before I could respond, a photographer approached, asking to take pictures of the firm's representatives with the judge for the charity's newsletter. I found myself standing next to my uncle, our shoulders nearly touching, but a universe of unsaid words between us. The camera flashed, capturing a moment I'd never imagined, my uncle and me standing as equals. No, not equals. In this room, in this context, the balance had shifted. The photographer thanked us and moved on to the next group of notable attendees. Uncle Robert hadn't spoken directly to me yet, hadn't met my eyes properly. He seemed to be searching for his footing, like a man who'd discovered the floor beneath him was not as solid as he'd believed. "I should greet the other judges," I said to the group, nodding politely. "It was nice meeting you all." Branford shook my hand again. "We'll be in touch about that panel, Your Honor." As I turned to leave, I caught my uncle's gaze for just a moment. In that brief contact, I saw something I'd never seen before. Uncertainty, perhaps even a flicker of respect, forced upon him by circumstances rather than freely given. I didn't look back as I walked away, but I could feel his eyes following me through the crowd. Later that evening, as I was speaking with the chief, judge about a community courts initiative, I felt a presence at my elbow. Uncle Robert, holding 2 glasses of champagne, one of which he offered to me. "Quite an event," he said, his voice carefully modulated. I accepted the glass but didn't drink. "Yes, it is." An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with the ambient noise of the gala, soft music, clinking glasses, the murmur of important people discussing important things. "So," he finally said, "a judge." I nodded. "For the past 5 years." He seemed to be processing this information, recalibrating, some internal calculation. "And before that?" "Assistant district attorney. Law clerk for Judge Winters when she was on the federal bench." Another silence. I could almost see him mentally revisiting every dismissive comment, every joke made at my expense, measuring them against this new reality. "You never said anything," he finally said, a note of accusation in his voice. I took a small sip of champagne, letting the bubbles dissolve on my tongue before answering. Would it have mattered? The question hung between us, deceptively simple, yet layered with decades of interactions. Uncle Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Family should know these things." "Family should know a lot of things," I replied evenly. "Like when to celebrate accomplishments, when to offer support instead of mockery." He winced slightly, the first admission I'd ever seen that his words had carried weight. "I was just teasing," he said, the familiar defensiveness creeping back into his tone. "That's what family does." I studied him for a moment. This man who had loomed so large in my life for so long, who had shaped my self-perception in ways I was still unlearning. In the elegant lighting of the ballroom, he looked smaller somehow, older. "No," I said softly. "That's not what family does." Before he could respond, Lawrence Branford appeared at my other side. "Judge Keller, the mayor has been asking to speak with you. If you wouldn't mind?" He gestured toward a small gathering, across the room. "Of course," I said, handing my barely touched champagne back to my uncle. "Excuse me." As I walked away with Branford, he leaned in slightly. "I hope I wasn't interrupting anything important." "No," I replied. "Just a long overdue conversation." "I have to say," Branford continued, "I'm surprised Robert never mentioned you. The firm values family connections." He paused, choosing his words carefully, though perhaps he didn't want anyone to think he was trying to leverage the relationship. I almost laughed at the irony. Perhaps. Well, no matter. Your reputation stands entirely on its own merit, Your Honor. My reputation, built word by word, case by case, in courtrooms where my voice was heard and my judgments respected, where no one interrupted me or turned my words into jokes, where I was never the punchline. The gala continued, a swirl of introductions and conversations. I spoke with the mayor about juvenile justice reform, discussed appellate strategies with a state Supreme Court justice, and exchanged business cards with nonprofit directors eager to involve the court in community education programs. Through it all, I caught glimpses of my uncle, watching me from across the room, listening as colleagues praised my recent decisions, observing as people approached me with deference and genuine interest in my opinions. By the end of the evening, as guests began to depart, he appeared at my side once more as I waited for the valet to bring my car. "Alice," he said, his voice lacking its usual certainty. "I was wondering if perhaps we could have lunch sometime, to catch up." I considered him in the soft glow of the venue's exterior lighting. This man who had never before shown interest in catching up with his quiet, unremarkable niece. "I have a full docket for the next few weeks," I replied, neither accepting nor outright rejecting. He nodded, hands in his pockets. Of course, you must be busy. The valet pulled up with my car, a modest sedan that seemed out of place among the luxury vehicles departing the venue. I tipped the young man and took my keys. It was good to see you, Alice, my uncle said, an unfamiliar hesitancy in his voice. I paused before opening my car door. Robert, I said, using his first name deliberately. Were you proud when you heard I'd been appointed to the bench? He blinked, surprised by the direct question. I didn't know. But if you had known, I pressed gently, would you have been proud? Uncle Robert looked away, then back at me. For perhaps the first time, he seemed to be considering his words carefully. I would have been surprised, he admitted. Not proud, surprised. Even now, knowing what I'd accomplished, he couldn't quite bring himself to acknowledge that he'd been wrong about me all those years. That perhaps the quiet girl at family gatherings had contained depths he never bothered to explore. I nodded, accepting this small truth. Good night, Uncle Robert. As I drove home that night, the city lights blurring slightly through my windshield, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not vindication. Those emotions would have required that I still needed his approval. What I felt was simpler, cleaner, a knot loosening, a weight lifting. I thought about calling my parents to tell them about the encounter, but decided against it. The story would spread through the family soon enough. Uncle Robert would tell his version, carefully edited to preserve his dignity. Others would fill in the gaps, adding their own assumptions and interpretations. None of it mattered. I had stopped needing their validation years ago, had built a life and identity separate from their narrow perception of me. What they thought, what they said, was no longer the verdict I awaited. The next morning, I put on my judicial robes and entered my courtroom through the back door, as I did every day. My clerk handed me the docket, my bailiff called the court to order, and everyone rose as I took my seat on the bench. Good morning, I said, my voice clear and steady. Please be seated. And everyone, attorneys, defendants, witnesses, observers, sat without question or hesitation. Here, in this room, my words carried weight. My judgment mattered. My voice was heard. I thought about my uncle briefly as I reviewed the first case file. Wondered if he was in his office at Branford and White, still processing the revelation of the night before. Wondered if he was sharing the story with colleagues, trying to find a way to spin it that didn't diminish his own standing. But only briefly. I had more important matters before me. First case, I announced, and the day's work began. 3 weeks passed before I heard from my uncle again. I was reviewing briefs in my chambers when my assistant knocked on the door. Judge Keller, there's a Robert Keller here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he says he's your uncle. I set down my pen, a ripple of surprise moving through me. Show him in, please. When Uncle Robert entered my chambers, he seemed diminished somehow. Not physically. He was still the tall, broad-shouldered presence I'd known all my life, but in bearing. He stood just inside the doorway, taking in the room with its law books, framed credentials, and the heavy wooden desk behind which I sat in my judge's robes. Uncle Robert, I said, gesturing to the chair opposite my desk. This is unexpected. He sat down, placing a small package wrapped in brown paper on the edge of my desk. I was in the courthouse for a hearing. Thought I'd stop by. I doubted it was that casual. The county courthouse was large enough, with enough separate divisions, that he wouldn't have accidentally found himself near my chambers. Is there something I can help you with? I asked, maintaining the professional tone I used with all visitors to my chambers. He shifted in his seat, eyes moving from the law books to the window and back to me. Your mother told me you're being considered for the appellate court, so that's what this was about, My nomination had been announced just last week. Yes, that's correct. Congratulations, he said, the word sounding stiff on his tongue, as if he were speaking a foreign language. That's quite an achievement. Thank you. I waited, sensing there was more. Uncle Robert cleared his throat. I brought you something. He pushed the small package toward me. Found it when I was going through some old files. I unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a faded blue ribbon attached to a small medallion. I recognized it immediately. The debate championship, award from my high school senior year, the only school event any of my family had attended, and only because my mother had insisted. You kept this? I asked, genuinely surprised. He nodded, a flush creeping up his neck. You were impressive that day, the way you took apart the other team's arguments. I remembered that debate vividly. The topic had been judicial independence, ironically enough. I'd spent weeks preparing, rehearsing in front of my bedroom mirror, timing my responses, anticipating counter-arguments. When the day came, something had clicked. For those 15 minutes, I'd found my voice. Clear, reasoned, unwavering. You never said anything, I said quietly, turning the medallion over in my hand. No, he admitted. I didn't. In the silence that followed, I studied him more carefully. The confident uncle who had dominated family gatherings with his booming voice, and ready mockery seemed a distant memory. The man before me now looked tired, uncertain. Why not? I finally asked. It was a simple question, but it contained decades of unspoken hurt. Uncle Robert sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. I don't know. You were so quiet all the time, so different from the rest of us. It was easy to overlook what was really there. It wasn't just overlooking, I pointed out, careful to keep my tone neutral rather than accusatory. It was active dismissal, mockery. He winced, but didn't deny it. I know. Do you? I pressed gently. This wasn't a cross-examination, but it was perhaps the most important questioning I'd ever conducted. He met my eyes then, really looked at me for what felt like the first time. Lawrence Branford has asked me to help prepare you for your Senate confirmation hearings, if you'd be willing. He says your appointment would reflect well on the firm. The change of subject was abrupt, but I understood the implied acknowledgement. My uncle was offering something he valued highly, his professional expertise, his connections, his stamp of approval in the legal community. That's a generous offer, I said carefully. But I have a team helping me prepare. Of course, he said quickly. I just thought... What did you think, Uncle Robert? He looked down at his hands, then back up at me. I thought it might be a way to make amends. The simple honesty of it caught me by surprise. I'd expected justifications, perhaps even subtle attempts to rewrite history, not this direct acknowledgement. I appreciate that, I said, and meant it. But I don't need your help to succeed. I never did. A flash of the old defensiveness crossed his face, then faded. No, he agreed. You didn't. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unsaid words filling the space between us. Not just the painful ones of the past, but potential futures neither of us had contemplated before. Your cousin Emma is considering law school, he said, finally. She asked if she could talk to you about it. Emma was his daughter, a quiet, thoughtful girl I'd seen only at the obligatory family events I still occasionally attended. I remembered her watching me from across crowded rooms, never quite approaching. I'd be happy to talk with her, I said. Uncle Robert nodded, standing to leave. I'll let her know. He paused at the door. You know, you look like her when you sit behind that desk. My sister, your mother. The observation startled me. No one had ever mentioned any resemblance between my mother and me before, especially not in a professional context. Mom had been the traditional homemaker, supporting Dad's career, raising children, hosting family gatherings where she deferred to the louder voices around her. "Mom?" I echoed, skeptical. "She was brilliant, you know. Before she married your father." He said it matter-of-factly, as if it were common knowledge. Full scholarship to Radcliffe, was planning on graduate school. I stared at him, trying to reconcile this information with the mother I knew, the woman who checked my homework but never spoke of her own education, who kept the peace at family gatherings by smoothing over conflicts and changing difficult subjects. I didn't know that. "No," he said, something like regret flickering across his face. "She wouldn't have told you. That was her way, to step back, to make room for others, for your father's career, for her children's futures. He shrugged slightly, for her brother's ego." The admission hung in the air between us, more powerful for being understated. "When I saw you at that gala," he continued, "being addressed as Your Honor, respected by everyone in that room, it was like seeing the path she might have taken in another life. I thought about my mother, her quiet competence, her careful avoidance of confrontation, her gentle redirections when family discussions became heated. Had those been learned behaviors rather than natural inclinations? Adaptations to circumstances rather than her true self? I should have seen it sooner," Uncle Robert said. "The resemblance. But I was too busy listening to my own voice to hear what yours was actually saying." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry, Alice." 3 simple words, offered without qualification or excuse. Not, "I'm sorry you felt hurt," or "I'm sorry if I offended you." Just, "I'm sorry." I nodded, accepting the apology for what it was. Belated, imperfect, but sincere. "Thank you for the medallion," I said, "and for stopping by." After he left, I sat for a long time looking at the faded blue ribbon, thinking about my mother and the choices she'd made. The paths taken and not taken. The voices silenced, and the ones that eventually found their way to be heard. I called her that evening. "Mom," I said when she answered, "tell me about Radcliffe." The pause on the other end of the line was so long I thought we might have been disconnected. "Who told you about that?" she finally asked, her voice careful. "Uncle Robert stopped by my chambers today." Another pause. "Did he?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "Yes. He mentioned you had a scholarship, that you were planning on graduate school." I heard her sigh, imagined her sitting in the familiar armchair by the living room window, perhaps with a cup of tea beside her. "That was a very long time ago, Alice. I'd still like to hear about it, if you want to tell me." And so she did. Haltingly at first, then with growing animation. She told me about her college years, about the literature professor who'd championed her work, the research position she'd been offered, the plans for a doctoral program in comparative literature. "What happened?" I asked gently when she finished. "Life happened," she said simply. "I met your father. I got pregnant with your brother. Priorities shifted. Do you regret it?" The question slipped out before I could consider whether it was fair to ask. Mom was quiet for a moment. "I made choices," she said finally. "Some were conscious decisions. Others were gradual adaptations. By the time I realized how much I'd stepped back from my own voice, it seemed too late to find it again. I thought about all the family gatherings where she'd smiled placatingly as Uncle Robert dominated conversations, where she gently touched my arm when I started to object to his teasing, silently urging me to let it go. Had she been protecting me, or herself, or both of us, in the only way she knew how? "It's never too late, Mom." She laughed softly. "Perhaps not," But watching you, Alice, seeing what you've become despite all of us holding you back, that's been its own kind of triumph for me. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. You never held me back. I didn't support you as I should have either, she said, an echo of her brother's regret in her voice. When Robert would make those comments, I should have spoken up. Why didn't you? I asked, not to condemn but to understand. Habit, she admitted. When you spend decades making yourself smaller, quieter, it becomes your default. You forget you have any other option. We talked for nearly 2 hours that night. Really talked, in a way we never had before. About expectations and silences. About the women we'd become and the ones we might have been. About voices lost and found. A month later, my Senate confirmation hearings began. As I entered the ornate chamber where the Judiciary Committee would question me, I saw my family seated in the gallery. My parents, my brother and his wife, a few cousins, and Uncle Robert, sitting beside my mother, both of them watching me with expressions so similar, I wondered how I'd never noticed their resemblance before. The committee chairman called the hearing to order. Judge Alice Keller, he announced, you have been nominated for the position of Circuit Judge for the United States Court of Appeals. You may now make your opening statement. I stood behind the microphone, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. The silence before I spoke reminded me of all those family dinners where I'd swallowed my words, all those gatherings where I'd retreated rather than engage. But this silence was different. It wasn't filled with anticipation of mockery or dismissal. It was the silence of attention, of respect, of people waiting to hear what I had to say, not because they wanted to counter it or laugh at it, but because they genuinely wanted to listen. I caught my mother's eye briefly before beginning. She nodded slightly, a gesture so small no one else would have noticed it. But in that tiny movement, I saw decades of unspoken understanding pass between us. Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee, I began, my voice clear and steady. I am honored to appear before you today. As I delivered my carefully prepared statement about judicial philosophy and constitutional interpretation, I was aware of a deeper truth beneath the formal words. That sometimes justice arrives not with dramatic verdicts or passionate arguments, but in small moments of recognition, in the gradual shifting of perceptions, in voices that find their strength not by shouting but by persisting. And sometimes, the most profound change happens not when others finally see your value, but when you no longer need their validation to know it yourself. 2 days later, when the committee voted to recommend my confirmation, my family gathered for dinner at my parents' house. The conversation flowed more naturally than I could remember it ever doing before. Uncle Robert was quieter than usual, more inclined to listen than dominate. At one point, my cousin Emma came to sit beside me. I've been accepted to 3 law schools, she confided, her voice low. Dad says I should talk to you about which one to choose. I glanced across the room at my uncle, who was listening attentively as my mother spoke about a community reading program she had recently joined. Our eyes met briefly, and he gave me a small nod. Acknowledgement, respect, perhaps even a touch of pride. I'd be happy to discuss it with you, I told Emma. But the most important thing is to find your own voice, and to never let anyone convince you it's not worth hearing. Later, as we were leaving, Uncle Robert held the door for me. Your Honor, he said quietly, the formal address carrying none of the mockery it might have held in the past. I shook my head slightly. Just, Alice is fine. When we're with family. He nodded, understanding the distinction. In courtrooms and legal circles, I was Judge Keller, Your Honor, titles earned through years of work and dedication. But here, in this context, I could simply be Alice without diminishing anything I'd achieved. Alice, he amended. The confirmation is just a formality at this point. Congratulations. Thank you. As I walked to my car, I thought about the long journey from that timid girl at family gatherings to the woman I'd become. The path hadn't been direct or easy. There had been detours and obstacles, moments of doubt and hours of solitary determination. I thought about my mother and the roads not taken, about Uncle Robert and the slow, imperfect process of recognition and amends, about Emma and the possibilities stretching before her. Most of all, I thought about voices, lost and found, silenced and reclaimed. How some command attention through volume, while others gain power through persistence. How justice sometimes speaks through gavels and verdicts, and sometimes through the simple, quiet affirmation of being heard. When I reached my car, I paused to look back at the house where I'd grown up, where so many of those painful family gatherings had taken place. Through the front window, I could see them all still talking, laughing, existing together in a configuration that felt both familiar and somehow new. Uncle Robert was no longer the center of every conversation, the arbiter of whose contributions mattered. The dynamic had shifted, not just between him and me, but within the family as a whole. Balance restored, not through confrontation or humiliation, but through the gradual, powerful assertion of truth. I drove home under a sky full of stars, thinking about all the verdicts we render in our lives, the judgments passed on ourselves, and others, the sentences carried out in silence, the acquittals that come with recognition and growth. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens or speeches or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it slips in quietly through side doors, dressed in black robes, and calls you by the name you've earned, not to shame or vindicate, but simply to acknowledge what has always been true. Your Honor,